Hello, I'm Erin McGough, the Executive Director for the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society, and I wish to share with you our recent project to reimagine the Bradford House Museum in Duxbury, Massachusetts. First, I'd like to ask you to imagine something for me. 150 years from now, your own home, your bed, your computer, your clothing, and your library are made into a museum. What would be the stories that they tell about you? How would your life, as ordinary as it is, be transformed into something that is enduring and important? Something that can interest people from another time and place, something that can sustain an organization and provide attendance and business. Can you even imagine that? Yet this is what we ask of our historic houses every day, and it is why so few of them tell the stories of ordinary people. Without a big name, a big accomplishment, a famous story, what can an ordinary house teach us? We all say that we are interested in the common person, but would we stake the future of our organization on it? Today I'm going to tell you how we did this at the Bradford House in Duxbury, Massachusetts, by reinterpreting the story away from the ship captain father and instead focusing on the four daughters. It is not a one-size-fits-all solution. This is so particular to your organization and your needs, but I hope some elements of our project will be useful to you. First, a word about Duxbury, as I know this may be a national audience. The town is sheltered within Duxbury and Cape Cod Bays in Massachusetts. For thousands of years, Duxbury was home to the Wampanoag Native Americans. In the 1620s, settlers from Plymouth, Massachusetts, expanded the borders of their town, and Duxborough was incorporated in 1637. We are mainly known for the active period of shipbuilding and wealth that came between 1790 and 1840, but then historically speaking, no one really talked much about the 19th century until the advent of the resort hotels in the 1870s and 80s. This is really important for the history that I'll talk about here. Today, Duxbury still has an active waterfront, recreational vessels, aquaculture, maritime businesses, and you may have tried our oysters. Duxbury has about 16,000 people, is within commuting distance to Boston and Providence, and it has a strong history of nonprofits and preservation entities. For our purposes, this is both good and a challenge. We have lots of support, but also lots of competition for resources as well. The Duxbury Rural and Historical Society was established in 1883. Our early mission was as a beautification society, installing street lamps, planting trees, those types of small projects. This is where the rural comes from in our name. The earliest acquisition was in the 1890s. It was the acquisition of conservation land at Round Pond in Duxbury, making the DRHS one of the oldest land conservancy organizations in America. Today we maintain 4 historic houses, have an archival library on a 5th property, and preserve more than 150 acres of land in Duxbury and Plymouth. Our budget is right around $600,000 per year, and we have a 5-person year-round staff with a full-time equivalency of 3. I would say that we are a little big historical society. We certainly serve the general region, but our base of support is definitely town-based. We also have a very active calendar of more than 50 program events and rentals a year, picnics on Clark's Island, house tours, archaeological digs, lectures, Christmas at King Caesar, maritime festivals, and more, just to name a few. We also have 15 active operating, standing, and project committees and a huge base of volunteer support. In short, we are an active, healthy, and thriving historical society. Except for the Captain Gershom Bradford House. Donated to the DRHS in 1968 by the 4th generation of the Bradford family, it was operated as a house museum since that date, telling the story of the ship captain father and known as the Captain Gershom Bradford House. The Captain Gershom Bradford House's interpretation was largely focused on the captain's maritime career, with the domestic setting actually doing little to enliven the story that was focused on. Please also keep in mind that we have another historic house which does focus on the maritime history of the region and does so in a far more interesting manner. The King Caesar House Museum, which is on the water. Ezra Weston II was one of the largest shipbuilders in New England during the Federal period, and his is an interesting story about industry, commerce, and ambition. Returning to the Bradford House, we had some practical considerations that were affecting our interpretation too. Today there are 4 rooms in the house, 2 parlors and 2 bedrooms. The house was divided in the 20th century for a modern tenant, so portions of the original house, including the 3rd bedroom and the kitchen, are no longer available. This made the space very confusing for the visitors to the Historic House Museum in the traditional sense. These images are the view through to the kitchen. On the left is a 19th century view, and on the right is the same doorway in 2017, which was closed off. The house also had water infiltration and deferred maintenance. The deteriorating house added to the lackluster and confusing interpretation, and serious accessibility issues contributed to the failure of the Bradford House Museum, and indeed by 2013 visitation to the house was almost at 0. Also around this time, we became aware that we had serious structural issues that were at a critical point. The fear, of course, was that we could not raise money for something that the community perceived of as having no value. We're also a product of our time, a debate that I'm sure this audience is familiar with. What is the future of historic house museums? Are there too many of us? Are we a byproduct of a past time without value in the future? Are small organizations overburdened with their responsibilities? And is the DRHS any different? We determined that if we wanted a future for the Bradford House, we needed to think bravely and creatively. We started by focusing on what was truly, quote, original to the story, and by finding a different way to tell that story. In looking at new interpretation, there were issues that we had to overcome as the scholars or as the interpreters of the material. One was the realization that there is an inherent challenge in telling lesser known stories. Often they are incomplete. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper, look at unusual sources, surmise, or make an educated guess. We are also the recipients of the history that has gone before us. The Bradford House was donated by Gershom Bradford IV, who was something of the family historian and who worked very closely with the DRHS in the first years of the museum. He actually went through the family archive and graded the papers as, quote, unimportant or inferior. Others were censored or redacted. He wrote hundreds of letters enumerating family history and his memories for the early staff of the DRHS, but he paid almost no attention at all to the letters and histories of his, quote, maiden aunts. Even Charlotte Bradford's Civil War diaries were not considered worth preservation. They were considered full of commonplace activities, and that's a quote from him as well. While we are grateful to Gershom for the work that he did to preserve his family's story, it's also an interesting reflection on how earlier generations have prioritized history, and with it, an awareness of our own bias. We also had to look at the exhibitions that were in the house. The exhibitions were just that, exhibitions. They were attempts at federal period that were put in place at the time that the DRHS acquired the house in 1968. A lot of objects went in and out of the house at that time through auctions as well as to related family members. So we returned to focus on what was, quote, good and original at the Bradford House. The house was donated with contents of the house, representing a compilation of several generations, as well as items brought in from related families through marriage. This is the original house plan from 1808. What is very valuable is the sizable archive that came with the house, spanning everything from household accounts to ship logbooks. This archive makes the Bradfords one of the best documented families on the South Shore of Massachusetts. The house, although relatively modest in size, is structurally unchanged. Many of the finishes inside the house are original, including original parlor paint that was an interesting mix of malachite green and Prussian blue, but unfortunately today looks muddy brown. Moldings, landings, balusters, they're all original in this house. The house still sits on its original 10-acre plot of land, and its footprint has never been moved or altered. The 10 acres came from the larger farm of Gersham's father. Late 19th century views of the house with the Bradford family in front of it are shown here in these slides. Thanks to the Bradford House's archive, we have a very good sense of the family and the changes in the house. The parents are still very much a part of the story as well. This is Gershom and Sarah or Sally Hickling Bradford. They were married in 1801. He was 28 and she was 30. They had known each other for 11 years, and there were actually 3 sets of Hickling Bradford siblings who married, so the families were well acquainted with each other. The house in Duxbury was built in 1808. The year prior, Gershom was taken prisoner by the French during the embargo of 1807, so Sally was the one who started the initial construction phases for the house. She raised money, cleared the land, got the architectural drawings completed, and she did this in addition to being her husband's business agent, raising her family, and running her household and farm. It should also be noted that the couple was passionate about each other. Their love letters to each other will make you blush. And Gershom was also an affectionate father. He was writing beautiful letters to his girls whenever he was away. But he was gone a lot. He was home for only one of his 5 children's births, a pretty common story, I think, for Duxbury maritime families of the period. Sally was from a prominent Boston mercantile family, and in fact, her mother, Elizabeth, after being widowed, owned and operated a retail store in revolutionary Boston, something that was pretty rare for the time. The store was located on Broad Street in Boston, and during the dozen years between her father's death and her marriage, Sally undoubtedly helped her mother with the business. Later, after Gershom's death, Sally actually maintained a money-lending business in Duxbury, which is evidenced in her probate. Historian Michelle Coughlin did extensive research on Sally and her mother Elizabeth and determined that there are a number of traits in the Bradford family that seem to run through the women: accounting and business skills, financial skills, personal resilience, and a supportive female network. The parents and later the children would be deeply involved in major civic movements of the 19th century, including temperance and abolition. The family was also directly connected to the changing times. They were related to and knew the Emerson family and other transcendentalists. All of this led us to the realization that there was a broader and more relevant story to tell. With all of this information at our fingertips, we began to zone in on a number of topics that we would tell at our Re-imagined Bradford House: women's history, education, abolition, temperance, transcendentalism, alternative medicine, Civil War nursing, and aging, health, and disability. Strikingly, when we speak about the children who would go on to live in and own this house, we are talking about the 4 daughters: Mariah, Elizabeth, Lucia, and Charlotte. We know from photographs, diaries, and letters that they were teenagers and young women that we would recognize. They were funny. They enjoyed friends and balls and fashions and parties. They would take a boat to Boston just to go shopping. There were whispers in the notes about interest in various men, and yet only the oldest, Mariah, married. There are probably several explanations for this, which we do discuss in the house. They were born at a time in the early 1800s when, at least in this social class, a number of women were not marrying. Their cousin, Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley of the Old Manse Concord, was a noted brilliant scholar, and she is documented as lamenting the restrictions placed on her intellectual pursuits by family and husband. Perhaps suitable partners were tough in a rural maritime community. Perhaps being abolitionists made them somewhat undesirable as partners, as the topic divided the community. Perhaps the advent of opportunity and education made marriage undesirable, as did the examples of their loving but absentee father, or their sister Mariah, who married for love but was rather unhappy. We will never know the exact reasons. But what we do know is that the daughters inherited portions of their father's estate, including stock dividends, which helped make ends meet throughout their lives. They supplemented their income with various jobs, teaching, sewing, and there's even evidence of a commercial buttery on the premises, which was discovered in the archaeological dig. Together, they maintained their household for 50 years after their father's death and 30 years after their mother's. In a sort of financial marriage, really, it's fair to say that it was the combined income that made the retention of the house possible. The daughters of the Bradford House were obviously well educated, first with local tutors and later sent to regional schools in Massachusetts. Their library, which is still at the DRHS, has annotated volumes, so we know who was reading what and when, and the books run the gamut from popular fiction, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Emerson, and novels, to Greek history read in Greek, to complicated mathematics and the study of alternative medicines like Christian Science, herbalism, mesmerism, phrenology, and other popular theories of the 19th century. The oldest daughter, Maria, married Claudius Bradford, who was a cousin. They were married in 1830. She was 26 and he was 29. And almost immediately they left for a Kentucky plantation, which was Maria's first exposure to slavery. They would go on to have 4 children together, and both were supporters of the anti-slavery movement. Claudius wrote The Higher Law in 1851. It was a direct response to the most sensational news story at the time, the Fugitive Slave Law. His view was that slavery was morally at odds with his belief in God and man, and that the Fugitive Slave Law asked the impossible of individuals. This sermon, The Higher Law, led directly to Claudius losing his parish and his home in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, and his story proved that abolition for some could come at very high costs. Sadly, Maria's is also one of the most poignant and yet universal stories, that of miscarriage and also the later death of a baby within the marriage. Important to our story are Maria's remaining children, because this is the line through which the house descended to the DRHS. Maria died relatively early on during the Civil War. She was recently widowed, but she had already determined to return home to Duxbury to live with her 3 sisters. The Union Martha Washington Relief Society was formed in 1842 with the help of Gershom Bradford Weston, a cousin of our family. They had parties to fundraise for families that were affected by alcoholism, and Elizabeth Bradford was secretary of the organization. In the 1830s, an average American consumed nearly 8 gallons of alcohol, including the hard stuff, per year. This included children as well. The social implications were huge. Families were in need, there were missing paychecks, and there were incidents of abuse. William Webster wrote in 1842, "We have also got great temperance meetings here in Duxbury. We have meetings almost every week. Some 400 to 500 have joined in town. The meetings are first rate. There are half dozen old sea captains who take right hold of it, all make speeches. The old toppers will come out and sign the pledge and tell their experience, then we cheer them." In Duxbury, a maritime community with many sea captains and sailors, the temperance movement became very popular and the Bradford family members were active participants. The Duxbury Anti-Slavery Society was formed in 1838, and it caused a rift in town over the topic. Despite this, the frequent visitors on the abolition lecture circuit were welcome in the Bradford parlor, at the dinner table, and as overnight guests. We know from correspondence at the time that it was simply assumed that visitors would stop at the Bradford House in their travels. These visitors included Charles Lennox Remond, an African American born free in Boston. He became an agent of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in 1838, and he would travel to the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. Abby Kelly Foster, who was a fundraiser, lecturer, and organizer for the American Anti-Slavery Society and a women's rights advocate. She married fellow abolitionist Stephen Simmons Foster, and their home in Worcester, Massachusetts is a known Underground Railroad site and a National Historic Landmark. Charles C. Burleigh, an agent and lecturer for the Middlesex Anti-Slavery Society and a regular contributor to the Liberator. Burleigh was a friend of Abby Kelly Foster, and he supported women's rights. He was known for his eccentricities, vowing never to cut his hair until the slaves were free. Sally Hawley, an abolitionist and educator who graduated from Oberlin College where she met Caroline Putnam, her lifelong companion. Hawley was an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society, and after the Civil War, she and Putnam established a school for former slaves in Virginia. Edmund Quincy was an author and reformer. He was an abolitionist editor and corresponding secretary for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and vice president for the American Anti-Slavery Society. All of these people are known to have stayed at the Bradford House. In Sally's obituary in The Liberator, an anti-slavery newspaper, it was quoted that their house, the Bradford House, has ever been a center of the reformatory action and a chosen resting place not only of anti-slavery, but various other departments of unpopular truth. The Liberator talks about the Bradford House. It's a brilliant anti-slavery legacy for Duxbury and one that the Daughters would continue. In the Bradford collection, we can also see evidence of concerns on the home front with the advent of the Civil War. Directions for canning and knitting socks for soldiers, cutting and rolling bandages, raising money for troops and supplies, and the ceremonies that happened whenever the soldiers came and went. Charlotte Bradford was an honored guest, home herself on furlough, when Company I, 4th Massachusetts were honored on their return home to Duxbury in 1863. In 1864, more than 140 Duxbury women, including Bradford relations, sponsored the bonus for the enlistment of William Alexander of the 5th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery, an African-American soldier from Mississippi. It was an effort to encourage recruitment and participation of Black soldiers, but it had the added benefit of counting towards Massachusetts enlistment quotas. So within the context of the Bradford collection, you are able to see evidence of Duxbury's effort in the war, and the efforts of women on the home front are in particular contrast with Charlotte Bradford's nursing experience. With the beginning of the Civil War, we also see the advent of social services, or organizations filling a social need. The United States Sanitary Commission was organized in June 1861 with two roles: to inspect the U.S. Army camps and hospitals, and to galvanize the benevolence of the North. Frederick Newman Knapp was a Bradford relation. He was a nephew. He was also the superintendent of the Special Relief Department for the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War, and this is how Charlotte Bradford becomes a nurse. Charlotte taps into her nephew's involvement with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, and she goes to Virginia in May 1862 to serve aboard the transport ships. Charlotte Bradford is 48 years old, and she packs up, having never really traveled far from home before. She's going into the front line of the worst conflict in U.S. history. Why did she do that? Her mother, whom she had cared for, had recently died, and I would also say she's feeling a call to serve. Indeed, she served for almost the entirety of the Civil War as a nurse, a rarity when the average nurse service is only a few months. There are 4 Duxbury nurses during the Civil War, and 2 of them are Bradford sisters. The first phase of Charlotte's Civil War service is the transport ships, which are steamships and floating hospitals which are bringing the sick and the wounded off the front lines of the battle. This is an invention of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, filling a need that was not currently being served by the military. Women are being placed on board to be genteel and don't initially have much actual nursing to do. But this quickly changes as the grim realities of war become apparent. Charlotte hits her stride and she loves the work, but soon the transport ships are militarized and taken over by the military, and all the women are sent home. Charlotte doesn't want to go, and so she hops ship to the capital. In Washington, D.C., Charlotte befriends Army nurse Dorothea Dix, who is engaged with the professionalization of the occupation of nursing. Dorothea Dix's requirements are that her nurses be between the ages of 30 and 50, no hoops, no jewelry, no makeup, not too attractive, and they have to have stellar recommendations. Charlotte Bradford meets all of this criteria. The two hit it off, and Charlotte eventually serves as a substitute nurse in all of the major hospitals in Washington, D.C., making her Civil War diaries, which are in the DRHS collections, even more valuable. Finally, Charlotte Bradford moves back under the auspices of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which has established a home for soldiers serving the needs of soldiers who need papers or need to travel on furlough. Quickly, they expand that operation to include the home for wives and mothers, and Charlotte served as the matron for both institutions. Her sister Lucia joined her for a period of time as well. At the Home for Wives and Mothers, she served the thousands of women who were converging on the militarized city, sick, desperate, and looking for news of their loved ones. Charlotte's role as matron is an utterly unique American experience. She was the one and only matron there. Hers is a unique Civil War experience. And her Civil War diary, which is also in our collection, is one of only 6 known unedited Civil War nurse diaries. The intake notebook, which was kept by Lucia, is also in our collection from the Home for Wives and Mothers, and it is an exceptional documentation of the experiences of these thousands of faceless and unknown women during the Civil War. Charlotte's contributions were recognized in her lifetime. She was contacted right after the war to be included in a book on the history of women's contributions in the war, and she modestly declined to be included. The authors of the book, however, felt that they could not exclude her, so they wrote the chapter on her anyway. At the end of her life, Charlotte applied for and received a military pension for her service, $12 a month. This was at a time when very few women could satisfy the requirements to prove military service. Charlotte, however, was able to. Her grave at Mayflower Cemetery in Duxbury is marked with a GAR medal, again something that very few women receive. I strongly believe that Charlotte qualifies as one of the most important historical figures in Duxbury. Turning away from the Civil War, we realized that we knew far less about the women as they aged. Indeed, the 3 remaining Bradford sisters came home to Duxbury and lived into their 80s, into the 1890s. Because they were not as socially active and because they were not traveling and therefore writing letters to each other, there is less documentation for this period. As we followed this process, we realized that there is a very interesting story about aging, adaptation, and disability in the house. Elizabeth suffered a stroke and was bedridden for the last 8 years of her life. Charlotte was sickly. That left Lucia, the oldest of them, caring for everyone with little outside help. We know for a fact that related family members were concerned about this problem, getting domestic help, when the sisters did not want anyone in their house. Many of our visitors relate to these issues when caring for their own elderly relations. So with all of this fantastic history and more, we knew we had a better story to tell. We began to reimagine Bradford to tell the story of these 4 daughters. First, to raise awareness and money, in 2015, we put on a contemporary art show in which we asked local artists to come and experience the Bradford House as it was then and to create an original work of art. The works were shown in exhibition, some of the works were acquired for permanent collection, and the whole project brought in new audiences to the DRHS. We used related furniture programming like that of renowned expert Brock Job to draw focus to the treasures in the Bradford collection. We brought a book expert, Ken Gloss, to talk about the Bradford Library. Historic New England experts helped us to match our paint analysis to real-life colors. And every step of the way, in everything that we did, even at other properties, we tied it to the Bradford Historical Collection and to the house. Forms of support came from many other partners, colleagues, collaborators, and contractors, and we acquired funding from sources like Mass Humanities, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and twice we went to the Community Preservation Act of Duxbury for support. About $30,000 was spent on exhibition research, design, fabrication, and installation. An additional $50,000 was spent on related projects like interior painting, electrical conservation. And in the end, we raised more than $525,000 for the Bradford House, with the bulk of which was spent on repairs to the building, but the selling point was the proposed exhibition and the history. I don't want to bore you with all of the construction photographs, but I do want you to get an idea of the exhaustive work that was done. We put in a new basement structural support, a new roof, gutters, and downspouts. We replaced multiple corner support beams, the flashing on the chimneys and the windows. We replaced rotted sills and did preservation carpentry and consolidation of woodwork, repaired shutters. we painted the building. And with the help of the paint analysis, we changed the color to the tricolor scheme that it was in the 1860s, a midpoint in the life of the sisters. We repaired foundation and masonry. We put in a new water main and connection. We collapsed a cesspool and installed a new septic system. We fully restored all of our windows. We worked on interior paint and the removal of old reproduction wallpapers. We replaced signage. We expanded and repaired the parking lot. We worked on electrical. We put in a new alarm system and fire detection system, a new access pathway, and landscape repairs. We did an architectural assessment, a paint analysis and interpretation. We rebranded and did print and promotional materials, an archaeological examination, the exhibition design and fabrication, the removing and storage costs, independent research, and more. The house was rebranded to be called more inclusively the Bradford House rather than the Gershom Bradford House, and a new corresponding date board was placed on the house acknowledging Sarah's significant involvement in the construction of the building, an important symbolic gesture and one that we are implementing across the board in all of our date boards. The new exhibition for Bradford Daughters Lives Well Lived opened to the public in July 2017, and the work on the house was finished that fall. The stories of the Bradford sisters, changing times and demographics, the evolution of community and civic involvement, the desire to live autonomously, the concerns of aging and health, they're very familiar to our visitors, and it is common to hear people say things like, "That sounds like my family," or "Nothing has changed since the days that I served as a nurse," or "It sounds like they were very ahead of their time." We also have a changing space dedicated to reclaiming forgotten histories, a mini exhibition that will allow us to focus on things that we haven't been able to exhibit before. Sometimes this is a story for which there is only one object, perhaps, or maybe it's just a story that we don't know much about, but the space is purposely dedicated to get us talking. The house is open more hours, it's friendly, we have hands-on elements, and we are able to welcome children in a way that we couldn't before. The exhibitions also function as a guided and self-guided interpretation. It's an element that was important to us as in some years, it's harder to recruit and train volunteer tour guides. Our bulletin board is interactive, and our visitors are asked to tell us, what do they fight for, embracing the spirit of the Bradford family? We were honored in 2018 to be awarded an Award of Merit Leadership in History Award from the American Association of State and Local History for the project to Re-imagine Bradford. This mark of approval of our efforts, in addition to being flattering, also helped our community to understand the significance of what we accomplished. Several regional newspapers have picked up the story, helping us to get the word out, and we are very grateful to them. In March 2017, we invited scholars and experts from all over the region to participate in the first inaugural Bradford Symposium, Reclaiming a House's History. In March 2019, our symposium continued with Hidden Figures in American History. It is our hope that this ongoing symposium will be a new legacy for the Bradford House, encouraging scholarship and the revisitation of history to capture elements that have been forgotten, overlooked, or are difficult to talk about. Just a few final thoughts. The response has been enormous. Visitation is way up, although we are having to learn how to sustain the initial level of interest. We also have to learn to use our new house, retrain our staff and tour guides, and come up with new programming. One of our continuing issues is that the house is simply too small to sustain large tour groups, and we struggle with environmental issues. But verbal and written exit surveys from our community are thrilled. It is common to hear, "I'm so glad you're doing women's history," or "I never knew women did that sort of thing back then," or simply, "I'm so glad to see the DRHS doing something different." And we did it while still maintaining the original purpose of the House Museum, to focus on the family. The house tells the story of this family unit and these four sisters. It doesn't rely on any one narrative. We managed to do this while still bringing to light new and exciting work. Today, the Bradford House is an asset that works for the DRHS instead of an albatross around our necks. The work at and with the Bradford will continue for many years to come, but together, our community membership and donors, together all of us, we have managed to save the house and to ensure that it will have a vibrant future, and our community is proud of itself. Now, I don't like to end my tours on the note of the death of the sisters. They were so much more than that, so I share with you this. The Duxbury Rural and Historical Society was founded in 1883, nearly 10 years before the Bradford sisters passed away. And it turns out that Elizabeth and Lucia were among the founding members of the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society. They were committed to doing good in their community, even in their last years. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.